Did I start recording? Let's see. Okay. You should have seen a little thing pop up. I think that says we are being recorded.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we did, let me just go over again what we did. Just phthalo blue with salt, kosher salt or sea salt works the best. Then phthalo blue with saran wrap smushed on top. We're going to let it dry. This is a toothbrush. Just getting some water on your toothbrush, some paint on your toothbrush and flicking, and you'll get really nice splotches. This is actually really good for, well, for a lot of things. People use it for snow and dirt and things like that. Let's see. And then we also have sponges. If you don't have like a natural sponge like this, you can use just a sponge from your kitchen. That's totally fine. So to use that, you wet it, squeeze the water out, pick up the color. This is great for anything else that's textured. We'll do trees later with this in the semester. I'll show you guys several different ways to do trees, but this is a good technique to use for that. So kind of fun. You can layer your color that way. And you guys should have gotten masking fluid. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't have any in my studio, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through how you would use it. So masking fluid protects the white of the paper. So let's say you're painting this pear and there's a bright highlight and you want to do a wash over that area, but you want to save that white. So what you do is you take your brush, you'd put a little masking fluid on it, you'd let the masking fluid dry on your paper, then you'd paint as if it wasn't there. So it's rubber, and so the watercolor will just completely go over it and it won't soak into that part of the paper. Then once your watercolor is dry, you're just going to take not the pad of your finger, because that has grease on it and it also will spread the pigment. You're going to use your knuckle or like the back of your hand or an eraser, and you're just going to peel that masking fluid off, and it'll save the white of your paper. It's pretty wonderful. One thing about masking fluid is it will ruin your brushes if you don't do it properly. So what I want you to do is, when you're using it, take your brush and dip it in soap, like Dawn or dish detergent, anything like that, to coat your bristles, then dip it in the masking fluid. I know that sounds weird, but that way it won't dry as rubber in your brushes. Otherwise, it completely gums up everything. And yeah, I don't want you to ruin all the brushes that you have, which I have done a few times. Yeah, so just any kind of soap. You can, even if you don't have like Dawn or something, just hand soap is totally fine too. Okay, that. I also have a few more kind of fun things that you can use in watercolor. So this is just rubber bands, and they've been taped. They've just been cut and taped. So it makes this like weird, it's called a funny brush. Like you can buy this at Cheap Joe's or whatever. It's called a funny brush, but I had a student make these for me. So you can just dip it in your water, pick up your paint with it, and again, create a nice texture. So kind of fun. Anything that can make texture, you can use lace. Dip your lace in the watercolor, lay that down. I've even used, this is very strange, but you can take, so put paint down, and actually I have some paper towels here that have texture on them. So let's try this. So you can take your paint. I'm going to lay a piece of paper towel down, and I'm going to paint on top of it and really saturate it. And usually the texture from the paper towel will come through. So we're going to let that dry a little bit. I've also used toilet paper, because toilet paper has some really nice like swirly designs and stuff like that. So just feel free to experiment in this class with different materials that you add into your watercolor. I'm totally cool with that, and it's fun for me to learn what other people use. For masking things, you can also use page reinforcers. You guys probably haven't seen these in like 10 years, but you can use anything that's like a sticker that's a shape. Put that down And then you can just paint right over that. It'll protect the white of the paper too. Once this dries, we can peel it off and we'll have a perfect circle with a circle in the middle. So with that in mind, you can use tape, you can use Scotch tape, masking tape, you can cut any shapes out, put it on your piece of paper and do the same thing, paint over it, let it dry, and then peel it off, and you'll have the white of the paper in that shape, which is pretty cool. So let's look at our salt. So we did get kind of a nice texture here. It's still a little wet, and you could tell because it's really dark there, but it did make a really beautiful like little bursts. It looks like snowflakes almost. So that could be used for backgrounds, even the center of your object. That's totally fine. Let's see what the saran wrap is probably still a little wet, but let's take it off anyway. So that created kind of an interesting texture too. You can do several different colors and then put this on top, make it look like brick. I've done that before. And you can make this look like, I don't know, if you scrunch it up in different patterns, different shapes, you can make it look like a lot of stuff. So let's see, this is probably still too wet. Yeah, a little too wet, but let's see if we can kind of stamp it and see what happens. You look really closely. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there is a little bit of the texture. So anyway, just play around with stuff, especially with this loose painting. Feel free to do, I don't know, anything that you can find. Add anything you can find from your house into your painting. All right, so let me put this down, and I'm going to get my other watercolor pad out. Oh, here's another thing really quick. So you guys got watercolor pads of paper that are loose leaf, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So watercolor comes in several different forms. There's that kind where it comes loose leaf, and like I did last week in the video, tape it down around every edge for every painting you do, otherwise it's going to warp. This is called a watercolor pad, a watercolor block, I'm sorry, a watercolor block. And if you look at the side, it's black. It's glued actually all the way around. And the only part that's not is this white little gap right here. And these are all the pages. And so they're really expensive. Not really expensive, but they're a lot more expensive than like a watercolor paper pad because they don't have this glue. So I think this small size is like $35 or something for however many sheets, 20 sheets. But what's nice is that you don't have to worry about the tape. So I just have a piece of tape right in the middle because I'm going to do 2 paintings on this. So, and you don't have that extra like border of white, which I actually like. But anyway, that's a little extra. Has anyone ever used one of these, or do you have one?
I have.
I use the Paul Rubens
Okay.
art block.
Good. So the art blocks are really nice for traveling, especially because you don't need to worry about bringing tape with you. You could just kind of just start painting on it. You don't need any prep work. One thing about the watercolor blocks, to get a piece of paper off, don't use anything sharp. I usually use a credit card and kind of shove a credit card in the middle and then use the credit card all the way around the edges, and it'll pry the paper free. So just as a little tip there. Okay, so for my painting, I'm going to use a pear. And let me just clean off my phthalo blue. A little wet. What questions do you guys have so far? Comments?
I want to see that sticker on the other practice.
Okay,
thing.
yeah. Once it dries.
Okay.
It's still dry. It's still wet. I mean. You can also use Q-tips. So I have them already bundled up and ready to go. So let me do this really quick because this is so fun for me and I want to show you guys. So you dip your Q-tips. I have a bunch here in your water, and then I'll just keep using phthalo blue because that's what I have. And you can create some really nice textures too with Q-tips. So just as many as you want, and just kind of you're kind of scumbling with them. So kind of fun. All right, back to my my pear here. So for your control painting, I want you to sketch it out as much as you can. Try not to do shading or anything like that. Just simple line drawing, contour drawing. I very, very gently just kind of sketched in where the shadow of my pear would be. Right here, right here. I didn't draw the whole thing in. So with graphite and watercolor, you want to work really, really light, because let's say like this dark line right here, I'll darken it even a little bit more. I don't know if you can even see my drawing, but this line is too dark. If I lay a yellow or even a light red over that, you're going to be able to see that. Even a blue, you'll be able to see that underneath my watercolor. And the more layers of watercolor you do on top of graphite, the harder it is to erase the pencil. So keep that in mind. This lightness, where in the image you can, or in the video you can barely see it, that's like perfect. So if you get too dark, use a kneaded eraser to kind of lift some of that graphite. So control painting, you're going to sketch out everything. You can use masking fluid for your highlight. Since I don't have any in my studio at the moment, I'm just going to kind of sketch in where a highlight might be. Okay, there's like 2 highlights there. All right. And then in your loose painting, it's, for me personally, it's harder for me to stay loose if I sketch it in, because then I feel like I have to fill in things. And the whole point of this is to be free with it. So me personally, when I paint, I'm a controlled person. So I have a really hard time staying loose. So as much as I can do to help me with that, I'm going to. So kneaded eraser, try not to use like a pink eraser or white gummy eraser. Those will actually kind of streak your paper, and they'll leave marks where the watercolor will look funny on top of those areas, especially if you're like pressing really hard. So if you do only have one of those, it's totally fine. Just go really lightly with it. So I'm going to start with the loose one just because I'm going to let some things dry and then I'll go back to it while I'm working on the controlled one. So another thing with a loose painting, I like to start using a huge brush, as big of a brush as you have. You have something like this, a flat brush, or a round brush. But the bigger, for me, the more loose I am. So in a pear like this, can you see the pear? It's a greenish, brownish, reddish pear. Let me turn it a little bit so it has more green. This one, I'm going to start with a cadmium yellow. Oh. So my water is super blue from that phthalo blue, which is kind of going to turn my yellow greenish. That's okay. We're just going to go with it. Okay, you can see my color. I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to it so that it makes kind of a dull green. Okay, so I'm going to first sketch in where my pear is. So remember, this is loose. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to throw in some yellow. So I'm working wet into wet, or yeah, wet into wet. So I'm putting paint down and then I'm adding water on top of it. And then I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to add color while everything is still wet. That way things stay loose. I can kind of figure out where my highlights are. So here's one. I like that little bit of dry brushing that's happening. Let's put in a little yellow here. There's a little bit of orangey red on the top and on the bottom. Try to stay as loose as you can. Try not to fill in things. So I'm going to leave some of that white. I'm also going to leave some of this white, even though it's not necessarily there in the pear, but I kind of like it. So I'm going to throw in a little bit of that red. There's a little bit of red on top here. And already I feel like I'm getting too controlled. So I'm going to take some water and I'm going to, where the shadow is going to be, I'm going to just take my water and kind of spread out some color so that my pear is not completely filled in. I feel like my palette is making a shadow on my paper. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. My shadow, when you're doing shadows, don't just use black, please. There's so many other colors. I mean, granted, this pear sitting on a black cutting board, so the shadow is probably mostly black, but throw in another color. even if you might not see it. So let's throw in, okay, so there is black that this table or this pear is sitting on. And my black that I'm using right now is Payne's Gray. So it's actually more of a blue, like a dark blue black. Remember, this is loose, so we're dry brushing. You can keep doing wet into wet. I'm also going to throw in, because I do see a little bit of purple in there. So if you have a purple on your palette, go for it. You can use it. Usually it's called dioxazine violet, and that's that color. If you don't have a purple, the best purple that I like to make anyway is using alizarin crimson, which is like this pinky color. Crimson with ultramarine. Ultramarine is already really close to purple. I'm going to post something about color and pigments and stuff like that so you guys have a better idea of what you have on your palettes. Okay, so there's a nice purple. I'm going to throw in a little bit of purple. And since I have the purple on my palette, I'm going to add some water to it, and I'm going to just do my background. And I'm kind of dry brushing, letting my brush run out. So one of the parts of this project, remember, is one of the paintings has to have a graded wash and one has to have a solid wash. So why don't we do, in this one, we can do a graded wash, meaning going from dark to light. So I just added a little bit of Payne's Gray into the top here. I'm working wet into wet, so the color is blending together nicely. Since this is loose painting, it doesn't have to be a perfect graded wash, but we get the idea. You can, if you have a spray bottle, another thing you can do is to keep things loose, you can spray some water on top of your painting, and when you look really close, you can kind of see some of those little splotches. On this pear, if you looked really close, you can probably see it in the video maybe, there are some black specks on it. Perfect time for a toothbrush. And you could use, I'm going to use an ivory black, which is actually more of a brown black. So I'm tapping out the paint, the excess paint on my brush, on my toothbrush, and I'm splattering just a little on my pear so that it looks like it has some of these spots. And I'm going to leave that one alone for now, and let's go to the controlled painting. Before we do that, questions about loose painting?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Does this worry anyone, the loose part of it?
No, I think that'd probably be the easier one.
Okay. All right.
Like, whoops.
Right,
It was
exactly.
really loose.
Work with mistakes, and that's a good thing. So for the controlled one, yeah, maybe it is a little bit more intimidating because we want it to look just like a pear. I just got water all over that pear. So with the controlled painting, we're going to start with layering. So in watercolor, like we talked about last week, everything that you put down, you're going to see. So you might want to start with the lighter colors first, because you can't really get back to light unless you're scrubbing things. So what I would do, well, let me clean my palette a little bit here. I'm going to keep this color because that's the color that our pear is. I'm going to start with cadmium yellow, which is a bright sunny yellow. To me, that's the color that it looks like is underneath this pear. Underneath all that green, it looks like it starts with cadmium yellow to me. The lemon yellow that I have is way too lemony. It's too fluorescent. So I'm going to do a wash and basically just fill in with a solid yellow my pear. So you can use a bigger brush. I'm using a size 8 round. You're going to try to be as smooth and controlled as you can. I'm working pretty quickly here just for the demo, so you're going to take more time to do all this, hopefully. All right. In the controlled painting, you're probably going to want to work wet on dry paper. So wet paint, dry paper, because otherwise you're going to have things like this where things start to blend together. So with that in mind, this pear is wet. I don't really want to work on anything that's going to touch the edges yet because they're going to bleed together. So I'm going to think of colors. We can use that same purple, I guess, for the top here, just for sake of time. So I'm mixing up ultramarine crimson to make a purple. Remember in our wash, with our wash techniques, we are using the follow the bead method like I did in the demonstration last week. So I'm mixing up a lot of color because we don't want to run out halfway through and then have to stop my wash and mix up more color. Otherwise, you're going to have a big, big hard edge right in the middle of your wash. When you're doing washes, and I know I feel like I'm throwing a lot of information at you, and I apologize, but we have such little time. So when you're mixing up color, I like to mix up with a small brush. I was mixing up with my size 8 round, and then I'm going to use a bigger brush to do my wash. And the reason being is, let's say I'm picking up color with my big brush. There's a good chance that paint can get stuck in the bristles, like big globs of paint. And then when I'm doing my wash with the same brush that I used to mix my color, you can get streaks of color in your wash, and then you can't really get rid of it. That line will probably always be there just because the paint gets super saturated and it seeps into the paper and it stains the paper. So just keep that in mind. Try to mix your color with a small brush and then do your wash with a big brush.
Should you ever get new, cleaner water?
Yes.
Does that ever affect your...
I would, but my sink is far away. So
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure.
And that's always something my students always bring that up. When I do demonstrations, I always just work with what I have. And actually, when I'm painting in my studio, I usually just work with what I have if I'm feeling lazy. And a lot of times, so I let my water sit here for days, and the pigment settles at the bottom, so the top of the water gets clear again. So you can do that too. Or just don't be lazy and go to your sink and fill up. All right. So remember, just like in our demo last week, I elevated the top portion of my painting to let gravity pull the paint down onto paper. Otherwise, you're going to get water bursts, just like Georgia O'Keeffe's painting. The water is going to seep back into the area that's starting to dry. So I'm going to start, I'm not going to go all the way to the edge just because it's a block. So I'm going to do a 2 brush strokes on top of each other to get a bead. So right now my bead is hovering over here on that side. You can see. I'm going to grab the bead and pull it this way. And because I'm using such a big brush, it's pulling up a lot of the water. So I'm going to reload my bead. And then every time I'm moving from my palette to my painting, then palette to painting, palette to painting, always reload every time. That way your color stays consistent. And I'm running out of color already on my palette. That's right. We'll make it work. Okay, so if I lose my bead, I'm just reloading it, and then I'm going to pull it. The bead is what keeps the whole strip of paint wet enough so that you don't get weird lines in the middle of your wash. So the nice thing about having tape, like if you have a taped border, it eliminates these like scraggly edges. If you're a very, I don't know, nitpicky person. I kind of like the scraggly edges sometimes, especially in like a landscape painting. So we have our pear to kind of paint around. I'm going to reload my bead. I have this little spot right here that I'm not touching. I kind of missed a little area. So here we come to kind of a crossroads. Do I finish doing just this little area, or do I jump back here? Always jump back to where you started first. Otherwise, this area will start to dry and you'll have a hard line. So don't forget about going back to where you started before you continue, like on this side. And I'll bring this up close to the camera so you can see I already have a little bit of a line that has formed. Okay. So we have a solid wash. We have a little bit of a blob here. not blob, but a little spot that I missed. That's pretty decent, pretty good solid wash. We have a little bit of darkness happening here. One thing I want you to notice about your color whenever you're painting and whatever colors you're using, there are some that the pigment starts to separate from the binder, which is the thing that's holding paint together. So in watercolor, it's gum arabic that's holding the pigment together. When we're using ultramarine and alizarin crimson, which you probably have those on your color palettes, those pigments start to separate, and on your piece of paper, you'll be able to see the pigment. It's so weird. You probably can't see it in this image. I'll try to get a better example of that up close, and I'll take a picture and show you guys. It's not your fault. A lot of students think, because sometimes it's really noticeable and they're like, what did I do? It's not you. It's just the nature of the pigment. Some are unstable, which is weird to say, but yeah, so they tend to separate. And you'll notice that on the palette too, actually. You can kind of see some little spots here. Do you see those little like dark spots?
Yeah.
Blue. Yeah, so that's the ultramarine. It's the pigment is separating itself from what we're mixing into it. And the yellow is doing that too. Okay. So we have our nice solid wash. We have our pear, the first layer. I'm not going to worry about the ground right now. I'm just going to worry about the detail on the pear for sake of time so you guys can see how to layer. So the next layer would be, what do you guys think? What color should I layer on top of this to make it more like that?
Green.
What kind of green? Like a light green, a darker green, the shadow?
Like a lime green?
Lime green? Okay. Yeah, we can do a lime green. Let's do that. So let's mix up a lemon yellow, which is more fluorescent. We're going to add some, I'm going to add some ultramarine to it so that it's not so bright. All right. And then I'm adding water so it's not super thick. We want the watercolor to be transparent. So there's a big area of light right here that's hitting from my window, and I guess you can see it from in the video, but I'm going to exaggerate that. So I'm going to paint around that area because to me, from where I'm sitting, this whole area looks almost yellow and the rest of the pear looks green. So I'm going to really quickly fill in this portion of my pear before this C shape dries. And just like the softening technique that we did last week in our techniques painting, I'm going to soften that area really quick. So I'm cleaning my brush, I'm dabbing it on my paper towel, and then I'm very gently going to use the side of my brush to kind of pull some of that pigment, soften some of that pigment so that it starts to look nice and round. I'm painting around my highlights. Another thing you could do is you can use the lifting method. So there's a little bit of highlight here. So I'm going to take my dry-ish brush and I'm going to lift a little bit of that color so that this starts to appear round. So there's a little bit more right here too. And a little bit, you might not be able to see it, but a little bit around the front of the pear. Okay, so we're starting to get a little bit of shape here. Once this dries, the next step would probably be to put in the shadow that's at the bottom of it underneath, and then also right here. Questions about that part?
How long does it usually take for watercolor to dry?
Good question. Well, it depends how much water you use, number one. If you use a lot of water, it's going to take longer, and you might be able to see from the side here. Let's see if I can get a good angle. Do you see how this piece of paper is kind of puffy? I don't know if you can see that. Maybe
yeah.
not. So it is, watercolor paper does swell. Use the back of your hand. The front of your hand has grease. If it's cool to the touch, it's still wet. This is definitely still cool because I just painted it. Even this that we painted a few minutes ago, that is still, it's still warpy and it's still cool to the touch, which means it still has water in it. You can take a hair dryer if you have one, and you can actually dry it with a hair dryer to make it dry faster. Otherwise, it'll take a few minutes. I mean, I could work see. I can probably work on top of this pair already. So let's do without messing anything up. Otherwise, yeah, if I went in on something that I had just painted, it would be working wet into wet and things would start to spread, which is not necessarily what I want in this case. Good question.
Would the hairdryer ruin any of the water, like the design you're trying to go for?
It won't actually.
Just use it as okay.
The only thing I would caution is with masking fluid. If you have masking fluid on it, just don't get the hairdryer really close to it. It will, what I found is the masking fluid wants to like adhere to the watercolor paper when it starts to melt almost. So yeah, just don't get it too hot.
Okay.
You can just put it in front of a fan too, if you have a fan going. That works. So the next step on this one would be this little shadow, and which to me it looks kind of brownish red. So I'm going to take a little bit of my cadmium red, which is kind of an orangey red, and I'm going to throw it into, let's see, I should have thrown it into my green here to make a brown. So complementary colors. Hopefully, I don't know, how many of you have taken a painting class before?
I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a little bit of acrylic.
Okay. And Stephanie and Jaden, have you guys taken painting before?
Yeah.
Are you driving? It's okay if you are.
I'm running late. I'm not running late, but I have to doctor real quick. I'm on my way. Yeah, sorry.
We can hear you just a little bit. That's okay. Don't worry about it. If you're driving, be safe and just listen to what we're doing. Okay, so hopefully you know a little bit about color theory. If not, we're gonna go over a little bit about it. But when you're mixing color, if you need a brown and you don't have a brown on your palette, try to mix up a brown. So complementary colors, red and green, and then yellow and purple, and so on and so forth. That makes a nice brown. And that I'm going to put under here at the bottom. And then I'm going to use our softening method. So I dried my brush after I cleaned it off, and I'm going to gently use the side of my brush. Feel free to flip your painting upside down and do it this way or whatever way feels more comfortable, most comfortable to you. So one thing I want to bring up, this little spot, I don't know if you can kind of see it right here. It did start to lift some of the color, and that's because the green underneath the shadow I just put down was a little wet. So that's what these paintings are about. I'm wanting you to experiment with the layering and the glazing, and you're gonna have some mistakes, totally fine. These aren't supposed to be perfect. I'm gonna add in a little bit more color on top of where that little splotch was, and I'm gonna let it kind of sink into that area. I'm also going to put a little shadow up here. And then I'm going to use my softening method. So again, softening, clean your brush, dry it off. You don't want too much water. Otherwise, you're going to have a water burst, which you might want in this painting. There's one right here, actually. That happened kind of nicely. All right, then I'll go back here. And then, so this painting, it's actually looking pretty good. Like we can add some more red here because there's a little bit of red. There's a lot of softening in the controlled painting, which is one of the harder techniques. But if you can do it, it does a lot of really great things for your paintings. So I would let this all dry. I would actually, let's let it dry, and I'm going to show you what happens when we do a nice solid layer of yellow on top of it. It's going to make it pop really nicely. So in watercolor, this is called glazing or layering or doing a wash on top of a wash. I'm not going to worry about this part right now for this demo. On this painting, what I would go back and do is the stem. And any other areas, if I wanted to layer, you can layer on top of a loose painting. That's fine. Just, again, make sure not to be too controlled. So I'm going to take the same brown that I mixed up. Maybe mix up a little bit more. And I'm just gonna throw in a little bit of a stem. you will notice that you can see through the stem. So if you want to fix that, you can't really fix that. You can take a small brush. Really, this is a size 1. And I'm going to really gently scrub on top of where I just put my brown. And what I'm trying to do with while doing this is that brown is wet, and I'm taking my brush, my little brush, and I'm trying to scrub away that black line that's running through my stem right now. Okay. And yeah, so let's let this dry. I would call this loose one finished. So that's probably about the completeness that you need. You could do more down here. So look at those student examples. I also posted in that folder, there's a PowerPoint that says student images. So there's some more examples of this project with fruit, because I was handing them all fruit to paint. But you don't have to do fruit. You can do something else, but just make sure it's simple enough where you're not getting too involved in the detail, especially in the loose painting. I really want this to dry so that I can do that one layer on top of it. So you can kind of, let's see, what else did I want to talk about? Sponges, masking. Right. Okay, well, that red is still super wet. Let's look at this and see what happened. So it bled a little bit at the bottom,
nice.
But that's pretty good. So you can do like a whole bunch of them, use tape, do, I had someone wanting to paint plaid, which a plaid like tablecloth or something. And so to do all those little lines, and to, you know how in some of the, I guess it's tartan, not plaid, but there's white lines. So she used tape and she cut tiny, tiny strips of tape, laid them out, and then painted on top of it. It worked superbly, but it just took a lot of effort. But still a good technique to use. With the salt, if you do use the salt, once it's dry and it gets really hard, use the back of your hand and just kind of scrub it off like that. It does like to stick to the paper, so there's going to be a little bit of texture left, but that created an awesome, love that, awesome texture.
Looks like a landscape from way up high.
Does, yeah, it does kind of look like, it almost looks like, I don't know, like an iceberg or something to me.
Yeah, that's really nice.
All right, so let's see. Super wet. When you guys are doing these, I would prefer if you did one per piece of paper instead of 2. I did this just for so you guys can see them both at the same time. How big of paper did they give you? How big of paper?
I'm wanting to say 8 by 10, but I'll have to look.
Okay.
I feel like it's more like a 9 by 12.
Okay, 9 by 12. So if this is a 9 by 12, yeah, if you can do one painting per paper, that would be great instead of 2 on the same one.
Can we work on the back of the same paper?
Good question. No. And the
Darn.
reason it's so weird, I know watercolor is very strange. It's just paper. You'd assume that you can work on the back of it, and you can, but it takes the watercolor differently than the front. The way they process it, I don't exactly know what they do to it, but yeah, it takes the watercolor differently. You can still do it, and feel free to try it, especially when you're practicing techniques. Use the back. That's totally fine. You'll notice a little bit of a difference maybe, and if you don't, totally fine, then use it. But yeah, that's a good question.
So yeah, mine's 11 by 15.
11 by 15. Okay, so
but I have a smaller size personally, so I could use the smaller, but yeah, I thought it was pretty big.
Okay, yeah, so I'll post an announcement about this they should be about 8 by 10. Your painting should be 8 by 10, 9 by 12, somewhere in that area. If you do have a big pad like that, cut it in half. Cut that piece of paper in half and use that. All right, this should be dry enough where we can do a couple washes on top of this, and then we'll be kind of done for now. All right, so let me clean my palette. cleanup is so easy in watercolor. I love it.
Mhm.
All right. So let me get my small brush. So I'm going to do one wash on the top portion of, let's see. Yeah, let's do cadmium yellow, which is a really bright yellow. So I'm thinning it out so that it's not really saturated. So what I'm going to do is I want to really just brighten this up. I'm going to do a wash or a glaze or a layer, whatever you want to call it, on top of almost this whole thing. What washes and glazes do is they kind of tie everything all together, especially if you've done a whole bunch of like different layers, like shadows and things. It does kind of tie the whole image together. So on this side, I did a yellow, a cadmium yellow. On the bottom, I'm going to use ultramarine, which is this paler blue, really watered down, so that I have a sort of darker wash on the bottom side, which would be in shadow. And then I'm going to soften the space in between them. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm not doing in this painting that you guys will be doing in yours, like the stem area. You'll be worrying about this little area, all the details of the color, and where certain colors are. So that worked out really nicely, I would say. You can at this point even lift more if you wanted to, if these areas weren't bright enough. This bright white area, what I would do is I would kind of soften the edges. You can even take, at this point, because I can still see my pencil line, I would take my pencil and try to erase a little bit of that. And then obviously do the shadow and the table and everything. When you're doing a table with a shadow on top of it, do the table wash first. Let's do ultramarine, just really quick so that you can see what I mean. So you're going to do this.
I'm sorry.
Oh, goodness.
Puppy. So you're going to do your table wash with a bigger brush, because this is kind of silly for me to be doing this with a small brush. But I'm right in the middle of it, so I'm going to keep going. So there's a few ways you can do a shadow. Do not paint the shadow and then paint the table around it, because the shadow is part of the table, right? So the table color is going to be seen in the shadow in watercolor because it's transparent. So otherwise it's going to look completely separate from the table. It's going to look like a dark object that we don't know what it is. So you can either do wet into wet, even for the controlled painting for the shadow, because shadows they do kind of fade. So you can do, I just added some purple and do wet into wet on top of the wet table. Or I painted the blue, I could let that dry, then paint the purple shadow color and then soften the edges. So there's a few ways to do that. All right. What other questions do you have for me? Concerns? Anything?
I think I'm okay.
When is this due?
Say that again.
When is this due?
These are due on next Tuesday.
Okay.
Everything's due at midnight. I don't grade until the following day. So like the assignments that you have due tonight, they are due by midnight tonight, and then I will start grading them tomorrow. Let's see.
Okay. And the ones due tonight is just the demo practice, right?
Right, and the getting to know you discussion board, which I think most people already did, and everyone
Okay.
did the EDA already. So, yep, those 3 things. And so, yeah, next week is the reading with the practice techniques from the book, and then that you'll post in a discussion board. I will post this all on Blackboard as an announcement, just so everyone is aware and on the same page. And then our next meeting is next Monday. And next Monday, I'm going to go over your first official painting. It's a master copy, which you may have done in a in a class before, but I'll describe that and I'll show you some techniques next week.
Alrighty.
Just to clarify, we need to fill up the paint, like fill up the entire page with the painting.
Yes. So look at those student examples that I posted in the folder, especially at the PowerPoint. There was a bunch of images, I believe, like 7 or 8 images there. And they're all filled up, yeah, to the edges of the paper. The loose painting, you might not need to do that. That's completely up to you. But the controlled painting, yes, try to get as much of the paper filled up as you can, especially with the wash. That's what I want to see you practice, these big washes.
Okay.
And oh, I just lost my train of thought. Like I was really gonna say something and then it went away. Oh my goodness.
That's me all the time.
Ah. All right, well, it'll come to me, maybe.
As soon as you close the meeting.
Exactly, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I meant to tell them. Yeah, what was it? Let's talk for just a second longer because I can like feel it coming back to me. Maybe I can't. All right, sorry guys. Right, but so yeah, experiment with things that you have in your house, in your kitchen, sponges, different types of sponges, your toilet paper, unless you're hoarding it. I understand you don't want to lose it. I still know people who are hoarding lots and lots of toilet paper from this pandemic. But what was it? Oh, this is gonna drive me nuts, guys. Anyway, all right, I'll post everything as an announcement, and I'm gonna hit the stop record button, and I will post this whole video so you guys can watch it again. And yeah, and look over the demo. Well, it's been fun. I will see you guys. So actually, that's a good point. Next Monday is our next meeting, and I don't have a time. It says time to be determined because I wanted to make sure that 1 o'clock works for you all. If it does, we're gonna just stick with 1 o'clock. If it doesn't, let me know. Send me an email or something if like you really want to be here and you can't. 1 o'clock works for me because my kids are both napping. So yeah, but I can make it work. Whatever time you need.
All right.
Sweet. Well, send me an email if you have any questions. I'm around.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
No
thank you.
problem. Have a good week.
You too.
too.
Bye.